Hey, good evening, everyone. This is Vanessa. I'm the secretary at the Historical Society of Frankfurt. Pardon me. All right, we are really excited tonight. We have a presentation lecture by Brian Michael and Andrew Weicker, who wrote a really wonderful, detailed book about the Frankford Yellow Jackets, who are a championship football team from Frankfurt, but that later became the Eagles, to my understanding. Brian Michael is a college professor whose love for sports history led him to open Scheib Vintage Sports in Center City, Philadelphia. It's an amazing shop. Definitely go check it out. And Andrew Weicker, Andrew Weicker operates several digital properties related to Philadelphia sports from his fan cave in Northeast Philadelphia. So welcome to both of them. We have huge thanks to give you both and everybody that you've been working with. All the donations of merch and things that you've done for us have been fantastic. And your lectures and books definitely get us some of the best crowd turnout. So here I'm going to bring these guys on. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight here at the Historical Society. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction, Vanessa for the online introduction, everyone tuning in on the streaming platforms. My name is Brian Michael. This is Andrew Weicker. Just briefly introduction, I grew up in Northeast Philly, just down the street from Knights Road. My grandmom is a graduate from Frankfurt High School, class of 40. They grew up in Tacony, so we have Northeast Philly roots. As Susan said, I run Scheib Vintage Sports, which is down in Center City. We also have stores in Wayne and Westchester, and we sell a lot of vintage style Philly sports gear. Kelly Green, some Yellow Jacket stuff, books, hats, shirts, all things like that. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, undergrad, and London School of Economics for grad school. I also teach economics and sports economics at Temple University. Andrew was one of my students when I was teaching at Holy Family University. So Andrew, a quick introduction.
Hello, I'm Andrew Weicker. I grew up in the Frankfurt area, attended Father Judge High School. And as Brian mentioned, I attended Holy Family University, where I graduated with a degree in sports marketing and management. And I had some classes with Brian as my teacher. And since then, we've developed a professional relationship, first with the Eagles book. And now we're going to get into this upcoming book, The History of the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets.
Yep. And as Andrew and Susan mentioned, it all started when we were researching for a book on the Philadelphia Eagles. There's copies back there for sale, but basically it was a photo history book on the Eagles. The first chapter was kind of pre-Eagles, Army-Navy games, high school football, and of course the Frankford Yellow Jackets. So we came here to do a little bit of research, use a couple photos for our book, but what we found was a lot more. There was literally a treasure trove of photos from what we'll see the 1926 championship season, every single game, programs from 1923 through the 1930. And then what we later found, some more ledgers, notes from meetings, accounting books, receipts, scorecards. So, within these walls is a great deal of history related to the Yellow Jackets specifically, but of course, Frankfurt in general as well. So for tonight, we're going to just quickly talk about the Yellow Jackets. The book is coming out in 2024, so there will be a lot more information there, but hopefully we'll give you a brief history. We'll talk about some themes that you might see as you go through the book or if you explore the history. One of which being the Frankfurt community, which of course is embodied here at the Historical Society. Much like the Green Bay Packers, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets football team was a community-based, community-funded team. There wasn't a rich owner like Jeffrey Lurie or Marshall or George Hallis or any of the owners that you see nowadays. It was very much community-based. We'll also talk a lot about the Pennsylvania Blue Laws and the effect that it had on the Yellow Jackets, their schedule in particular. This was early days of football, so we'll also discuss some themes like players coming and going from the team, but also playing on other teams, sometimes at the same time, sometimes on the same weekend. Teams coming and going. It was really the Wild West of football back in the day, not the professional organization that we've seen today. And then finally, the Yellow Jackets, a major theme from them is winning. It's a winning culture, right? If we went through every game tonight, it would be boring because it would be a lot of wins. They would win on Saturday, then on Sunday, then on Thursday. The team was really good, and that's a really important part about this. It makes the team exciting to research. So, like I said, we've done a lot of research here at the Historical Society. Before us, Howard Barnes put together this scrapbook back in, I think it was 1985, 1987, something like that. And this is really the only other publication on the Yellow Jackets, other than hopefully what we have coming up next year. So we're really indebted to him for his research, for him putting together, scrapbook pages of the teams, game accounts, schedules, players, things like that, most of which is found, again, here in the walls of the Historical Society. So we kind of think of our book as a continuation of his project. So we relied heavily on it. Ours is more of a photo book and with stories throughout. His is more of a scrapbook with, newspaper clippings. So if you're interested, this book's for sale here from the Historical Society. Very interesting. I encourage you to pick it up. So like I said, between his research, what we found, including, like I said, some old football ledgers from 1907, right? Here you can see how much they were making on games and paying out. It was in the hundreds of dollars. But you can see some of the different teams that they were playing. University teams, naval bases, the Mohawk AC, right? So all over the place, they were taking any game they could and basically winning all of those games. So those are some of the themes we'll get into today. First of which being the Frankford neighborhood, right? We all know the enclave that we have here, previously the borough of Frankford, Oxford before that, and it really is a city within a city, and that's something that's come up throughout the research as we look at all of the support behind the team. One of which was the team photographer, Will S. Gibson, who had a general store that sold pretty much everything from phonographs to bicycles to automotive parts to photography equipment. And he was the team photographer, and a lot of his photo negatives are here in the Historical Society. So we're thankful that he was there to capture a lot of the games, that the Historical Society was able to preserve them, and more recently, Susan for scanning them digitally. And now able to be published and for a lot of people to enjoy. So that's very exciting. And it starts with this fella here, Bill Gibson. Some other local people in the community, Franklin Smedley, you may have heard of. He donated this building, right? Isn't that correct? One of the founders of the Historical Society also owned a lumber yard with his brothers, right? He was a part of an influential family here in Frankfurt and was a vendor for the Yellow Jackets. His lumber helped build the grandstands and the fence around the parks, the different parks that they played at. Also, we have here on the left, Howard George. He was an original member of the Yellow Jackets and I believe on the board of directors in the early years, but he was also a vendor of the team, providing uniforms, equipment, and things like that for the club. So it was very much a community-based team. A lot of the players came from the local American Legion post, and we'll see that theme come throughout as well. The Legion and their band and their supporters and their members were always part of the Yellow Jackets. They went hand in hand throughout the Yellow Jackets history. Before the FAA started, the Frankfurt Athletic Association, which is the sponsor of the Yellow Jackets football team, the community organization that sponsored the team, all the way through the end, right? So again, Frankfurt benefited by being a transportation hub. Obviously, in 1922, the L opened, which brought a lot of people here. Even before that, being on Kings Highway, a major trading road between Bucks County, central Philadelphia. So there was always coming and going, right? People talking, people organizing, people coming to sell goods, right? As more mills and factories opened and people had regular jobs, right? They also had more time for leisure. This was around the turn of the century, Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, and sports teams in the neighborhood started to organize. So we have a picture here of the Oxford Baseball Club. We also had the Pennant Club and the Central Club. Pennant Club was based out of John Cooper's cigar store down on Frankfurt and Oxford. And the Central Club was based out of the Central Methodist Episcopal Church that was located at Orthodox and Grissom Street. So the Central and the Pennant Club were the big sports clubs in the area before Frankfurt Athletic Association. When they played football, the whole town turned out. The newspaper accounts said it was a college-like atmosphere, everyone dressed in their colors with their pennants, right? You can imagine everyone streaming to the fields from all the different neighborhoods in and around Frankfurt, right? So the Pennant and the Central Club were a big deal, and local business leaders saw that. And that was kind of the whole idea behind starting the Frankfurt Athletic Association. They wanted to capture that community spirit that came out on those days when Pennant and Central played each other, but do it every weekend, right? They wanted everyone in Frankfurt to have a team to root for, and that's how we kind of got the genesis of the Frankfurt Athletic Association. Early in the days of when they first started organizing in May, in the summer of 1899, they were looking for a place to play, right? They needed grounds for the particularly baseball and football team, but the club also sponsored rugby, cricket, and lawn tennis, right? What they found was Worcester Park, right? Worcester Park located here on Oxford Road, right? The diagonal that kind of cuts through the map, and then towards the top where the land is a bit empty, that's Leaper Street, right? Leaper Street and Oxford Pike or Oxford Road is really where the Frankfurt Athletic Association started. That was their first grounds, Worcester Park, right? You can see here, it's the northern border. This is a map from slightly later, after 1909, once the property got turned over to the city of Philadelphia, and of course, Frankfurt High School was built on that land. So we'll get to that in a minute, but you can see here now Harrison Avenue cuts north of Oxford just 10 or so years later. But before Frankfurt High School, we had Worcester Park, right? And if anyone knows about Worcester Park or the Worcester brothers, they were rather eccentric. This was a large plot of land with animals roaming freely, elaborate, ornate barns all over the estate, right? And the brothers lived there up until the early 1890s. There was some fighting over their inheritance and what would happen to the land. Apparently, once they died, the land went to the executors of their will, which the family thought was a little bit odd. And what turned out is the family and the executors ended up splitting the land. That's how part of it eventually got sold to build Frankfurt High School. But just before Frankfurt High School was there, the Frankfurt Country Club was on this location. So from the early 1900s up until just after the 1910s, the Frankfurt Country Club, which eventually merged with the Tarsdale Frankfurt Country Club and has a location up further in Northeast Philly, now part of the Union League. All part of this Worcester estate. So the Frankfurt Country Club was there, and they shared the grounds with the Frankfurt Athletic Association. So they used the grounds for football and for baseball, right? But by 1909, part of the grounds were sold, and the high school was built. Right? And you can see the magnitude of the high school. Here's the clubhouse. This was a part of the Worcester estate, then turned into a clubhouse, then turned into the first schoolhouse for Frankford High School, and then it was quickly dwarfed by the building that we all know today, right? So you can see the FAA was starting to have their grounds encroached here on Worcester estate once the Worcester brothers died and their lease ran out. Their lease ran out in 1909, and that's when issues arose about continuing the organization. But before we get into that, let's talk about some of the beginnings of the Frankford Athletic Association. Right, here are some of the board of directors. James McMaster was the first president. Right, they met on May 25th, 1899 at the Suburban Club, where they decided they were going to offer 100 shares at $10 a piece to become a member of the FAA. You could also buy individual memberships for people that weren't part of the organization. So $5 a year for men, $2.50 for ladies, and $1 for juniors. And if you had any of those memberships, that essentially gave you season tickets to all of the FAA sporting events, right? So you could be a part of the organization, right? A dues-paying member, buying shares, one of those first 100 shares, and those members are listed. I think we'll have a picture in our book. But like I said, it's a community organization. It was a not-for-profit. The directors did not get paid to run the team. The coaches did get paid. The players did get paid. But any profit that was made was then donated, usually to either the Boy Scouts, right, the hospital, Frankfurt Hospital, the Frankfurt Day Nursery. I think they donated a coal heater to the nursery. They've also built a water fountain at one of the parks, right? So all the money that was made from the early days of the Frankfurt Athletic Association went right back to the community. And that was true all the way till the end. So it was very much community-based atmosphere, right? And in the early days, the baseball team is what dominated the Frankfurt Athletic Association. So from 1899 to about 1909, the FAA primarily was a baseball organization. Now, baseball was growing at that time. Football was more either of a college sport or professionally was really just starting out in the Midwest. So baseball was really the thing for the FAA. And I know this picture is a little blurry, but you can see the expenditures and the money coming in. It was $1,600 for baseball, $600 for football, right? So it really dwarfed the football team, and baseball was key. And in fact, in 1905, the baseball team won the league championship. We have a picture of that with their banner, although we're still trying to identify the name of the league from back then. So still more research to do with some of the baseball sides of things. We did come across a picture here of Oxford Street grounds, which may or may not be a photo of Worcester Park. Certainly Oxford Street grounds is a location where Worcester Park was, but either way, this is a contemporary photo, so it gives you an idea of folks enjoying a game, just like we would down at Citizens Bank Park or Lincoln Financial Field. And we have a lot more fun fan photos as we'll get into. So again, early days, the FAA was focused on baseball. Of course, they did have the football team in 1899. Here's a picture of the first Frankford Yellow Jackets football team, right? With the manager and ball boy up front and the team in the back. Our book goes through a good description that was passed on in one of the game programs later in the existence of all of the players and their histories. So we have a quick bio for all the players that you'll see in our book. And the football team played local athletic clubs, right? A lot of YMCAs in the area, Jefferson Medical College, Atlantic City, which turned into a big run for the team, and also Holmesburg. Holmesburg, Frankfurt games was the big game of the year. That's the one that you would circle on the calendar. That's the Eagles-Dallas game, right? Holmesburg, Frankfurt. No love lost between those two teams, right? So those were big rivalries. They played Atlantic City every year. In the beginning, you can see it was in November, but then they got into the habit of playing Atlantic City earlier in the season, in early September when it was a little warmer out, so that everyone could enjoy the beach. They played Wildwood as well, and you can see some of the teams here. And again, this was their first year. They won all their games, right? They continued to schedule more games. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company was another rival that they played many times. As you can see, the only team that defeated them in their first year. All right, so they gave them a little bit of trouble. Soon after they started the football team, they also started a junior team. Right, so they had the midgets that would play occasionally before the games. Again, just kind of showing that this was a community-based team. Right, it was. The American Legion would come out before the games, play the national anthem. You would have the kids coming out to play. There was always some sort of halftime activity. So it was really a family-friendly atmosphere. And just some things to note. It's hard to tell from these photos, but you can certainly see from the pennant here and some of the programs that are on display here at the Historical Society that the team's colors were blue and yellow. Right, you can see from the shirts as well. And those colors are based off of the flag of Philadelphia, which is blue and yellow. I think it's up here, right? And that in turn was based off of the flag of Sweden because there were so many Swedish settlers when the city first started. So that's kind of the idea of where the yellow in the Yellow Jackets came about. Around 1900, the Frankfurt Herald first referred to the team as the yellow and black. They did have black trim. Obviously, their boots and belts and what little equipment they had was usually black. So the black trim, the yellow uniforms really gave the appearance of a yellow jacket. So when the team started in 1899, they were not called the Yellow Jackets. That, like many nicknames, was given to them by the press. Right? So the Yellow Jackets name kind of evolved slowly as they started. Right? First mentioned though 1900, a year after they started. Again, a note about football at this time. Right? It was more like rugby. Right? Not the high flying action that we see today in the NFL. A lot of people refer to as 3 yards and a cloud of dust. Right? There was a lot of that, a lot of ties, a lot of 0-0 games, although there were some blowouts. But the game was a little bit different. Touchdowns were worth 5 points, field goals 4 points, right? And it was more of a rugby type atmosphere, right? It wasn't until the forward pass came along, the players became more professionalized, that the quality really rose. And we'll talk about that here in a minute too. However, once the property was sold to the city and the high school was being planned to be built on the grounds, that caused a problem. Right? The baseball team had already started to schedule fewer games by 1908. And by 1909, when they broke ground for the high school, the club was in dire straits, right? This is a letter written to one of the shareholders, basically saying that we decided to sell all the property and indebtedness, right? This action was prompted by the loss of the grounds used by the association. And since they were $350 in the hole, they needed all 100 members to contribute $3.50. And this was the letter that was sent to the members asking them to mail in their check for $3.50 so that they could tie up their affairs. So it was a very unfortunate incident, unfortunate at the time. However, many of the players that started with the Yellow Jackets continued on under the name the Loyola Athletic Club. So around 1909, the Yellow Jacket or the Frankford Athletic Club stopped as an organization. The Loyola Athletic Club started, right? They kept the same uniforms, colors, and by 1912, they started calling themselves the Frankfurt Athletic Association and the Yellow Jackets. So in a way, this is a separate organization than the first. And you'll see as we go through the history, or if you read some of the newspapers or the references to themselves in the programs, occasionally they'll say the team starts in 1912, but also there's mention of the old timers. A lot of the old timers came out to the game, or the original members, right? So there's kind of this nomenclature of players and people that helped organize the first club versus those that came later with the Loyola Athletic Club, right? Shep Royal was the president at the time, and he led the team and the Frankfurt Athletic Association through expansion between 1912 and the 1920s. Again, here's an example. Now, it was a $100 bond to join the team. This was in 1923, and it was the bond paid due in 1928, right? So again, people saw this as an investment. They saw it as a way to promote Frankfurt in general, right? That was a big deal for the business leaders in the area. The programs actually mention how that they're excited that the name Frankfurt is seen in the San Francisco Chronicle and the London Times, right? It's not Philadelphia Yellow Jackets, or it's not an article about Philadelphia. It's an article about Frankfurt and the Frankfurt football team and the scores from Frankfurt. So they saw this as an investment, as a PR tool for the neighborhood, right? So that was really the community-based approach to this club. As I mentioned before, the Pennsylvania Blue Laws had a pretty significant effect on the Yellow Jackets from the beginning all the way through in the 1930s. So as you may or may not know, basically a lot of stores and things were closed on Sundays, right? You couldn't play professional games on Sundays. You couldn't sell alcohol at the stadiums, right? Connie Mack was a big proponent of getting these blue laws repealed because he wanted to be able to sell beer at his stadium up at 21st and Lehigh. But the blue laws meant that the Yellow Jackets couldn't play their games on Sunday, right? And of course, we know that's when everyone plays football, Sunday, right? Professional teams play on Sunday, college teams play on Saturday, the high school teams play on Friday, right? We know that. But with the blue laws, and since they were heavily enforced here in Philadelphia, the Yellow Jackets would play their home games on Saturdays, right? Then they would play away games on Sundays, right? So this means that they would play 2 games in a weekend, whereas most teams would only play 1. And that worked to their advantage, but also to their disadvantage. In one sense, they were able to win more games than most other teams at the end of the season. There weren't fixed schedules or minimum number of games. So they would often finish with more wins, sometimes more losses, also than most teams. But it also meant that they played back-to-back games, right? A lot of times they would play, for instance, the New York Giants here in Frankfurt, and they would ride the train back up to New York the next day. Or many times they would ride the overnight train to Chicago, right, or Buffalo, and then play a football game the next day. Right. So many teams didn't do that. Sometimes when these teams would play the home and home, they would, but that wasn't the case every week for the other teams. It was the case for the Yellow Jackets. Furthermore, if they didn't play a home and home, usually the visiting team, after they played Frankfurt on Saturday, would play up the Pottsville Maroons on Sunday. So Pottsville benefited from having a team playing back-to-back games as well. Right. So they got, the beat up team after Frankfurt played them on Saturday, they get to play them on Sunday. So it worked to their favor in that they played more games than any other team in the country, but also against them because not usually, but most of their losses did come on back-to-back days. Right. And when they would play Thursday Thanksgiving games or Thursday games otherwise, sometimes they would be playing 3 games in 4 days. Right, so this was unique to the Yellow Jackets. The other teams were not playing this many games, and this was all because of the Pennsylvania Blue Laws. Ironically, the team disbanded just before the Blue Laws were repealed. This picture is from a rally out in Harrisburg trying to get the Blue Laws repealed in 1933. And you can see there, that is the Yellow Jackets announcer, Bobby Calhoun, lending his services to help get those laws repealed. So even though the Yellow Jackets were no longer a team, he was still cashing in on his fame, as we'll talk about too. Bobby Calhoun would advertise products in the programs. He would do all sorts of events around the city. He was actually a pretty famous guy in the 1920s, right? So as the team started growing in the late teens and early 20s, it changed from the Sandlot football team of locals that used to play for Pennant and Central team, or the Oxford club that we talked about earlier, or the picture that we saw earlier. Now it was more professionalized players from colleges, mostly local colleges, but they were big-time programs. That was one of the other issues about the Blue Laws. Because the Yellow Jackets were playing on Saturdays, they had to compete with the big-time college football programs in the area, like Penn State, even Temple, Lafayette, right? So again, even more telling about, how they could survive as a football team with all these things working against them, right? One of the big teams of the time, the 1919 Penn football team, it featured several Yellow Jackets, including Heine Miller, who later became the coach of the team, Lud Ray, who we'll talk about in a little bit, who was also the Eagles' first coach, Howard Berry, Lou Little, Bob Fowell was the coach, and he later coached the Philadelphia Quakers as well as the New York Giants. And, of course, the captain of this team was Bert Bell. Anyone know who Bert Bell is? Of course, the first, yes, he founded the Eagles. So this 1919 Penn football team has a big tree that comes out of it, from the Yellow Jackets to the Eagles to Temple. A lot of coaches and players came off this team. And again, this is around when the team became more professionalized. As I mentioned, Heine Miller was one of the players. He became the coach in 1922 and really brought this kind of professionalization. And you can even see it. The players are bigger, right? And there was more practices. There was more tryouts. They had training in the summertime. Right, so the professionalization started to grow. They started to schedule more games, right? A lot of the games, like we mentioned, were local teams, Jefferson, the local YMCAs. But now they started to expand their schedule and play some of the teams up in the coal region, the Anthracite League, as they called it. So that would be teams like Shenandoah, Gilberton, Lycan, Pottsville, of course, Coaldale. Right? They would play all these teams, mostly at home, and they would beat them. They would beat their brains out. The games were 30, 40, 50 to nothing. And usually they would play these teams early in the season, the coal region teams, and then they would sprinkle in local teams as well as some of the early NFL teams. So the New York Giants, Buffalo, Providence, and then we'll see some of the other NFL teams at this time. They scheduled these games, and they won these games, right? In, let me see, 1922, they were 13-0-1. Their only tie came against Buffalo, who went undefeated and won the championship that year. But again, this wasn't an organized championship. There was no Super Bowl, televised to billions of people. The championship was whichever team won the most games. Or if you played the other local team, you were the championship of that city. Or if you beat most of the teams in the Northeast, you were the Northeast champion, right? It was basically, again, whatever the press mentioned in the newspapers. But the Yellow Jackets were consistently winning, and they were growing, right? They moved from Worcester Park to a place called Browns Field, right? The owner the farm that used to be there. His name was Farmer Brown, and it became known as Brown's Field, just north of where they played at Worcester Park. And that stadium held about 5,000 people. But for some of the bigger games against Holmesburg and Atlantic City, they would get upwards of 12,000 people there. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find any photos of Brown's Field. We do have some good information thanks to Fred and Bruce's papers that they've written about the Yellow Jackets and their fields and their history, but unfortunately no photos of that time. But they were growing and decided to, of course, build their own new stadium, right? This was Frankford Stadium, kind of the jewel of the neighborhood, $100,000 facility located at the corner of Frankford and Devereux Streets. As you can see, grandstands on both sides, plenty of parking, right? This was 1923 when the stadium came about. People were starting to drive cars more. Still, it was only about a half a mile from the L stop, so people could easily access the stadium. And this held up upwards of 10,000 people, but occasionally hit 15,000. Again, the attendance figures were very round back in the day. The newspaper reports were generally 5,000 people, 6,000 people, 10,000 people at the games, right? Again, bigger games, certainly they would sell out at this time. But this was a big deal for the Yellow Jackets. They had their own stadium. They had their own grounds, right, that they owned. They weren't leasing it anymore, so that they built and owned this asset. And you can see here a map of the field superimposed on Harbison Avenue, right? Harbison was not extended at this time, right? But the one at the top is Frankford Avenue, right? And the one that comes down is Devereux, right? And you can see how it was oriented, kind of facing Frankford Avenue, right? So that's where it is. That's where the stadium existed. And you can see the crowds came, right? It was a full house for many games, easily 10,000 people during this period. Like I said, the teams were winning, and people wanted to see good football. Quick question.
The question before, the photo before, where's the Burger King?
The Burger King at Harbor. It's actually right here is the corner. I wouldn't say 5 points, but where the big intersection kind of comes together. I believe there is a.
It's not that good. It's not showing.
Oh, it's not. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a cursor with an arrow that's showing.
So that's right there. Is where the Burger King would be.
Yes, the big intersection, right where it comes down from 41st Wards, straight down from there. And the Yellow Jacket Stadium is here, that rectangle. So they had their own stadium, 1923, 1931. They went 69, 18, and 12 at the stadium, so certainly a home field advantage. They called it Frankford Stadium officially, but it was also known as Yellow Jacket Stadium. The newspaper called it the Hornet's Nest, right? So there were a lot of, puns related to the Yellow Jackets, as it were. So it was a home field advantage. It used to be the Frankfurt Driving Club, but it was a great big ground that they were able to, again, build grandstands, build press boxes, build private boxes, right? They had a scoreboard, right? So it really professionalized the team. So like I said, as we get into the 1920s, the team becomes more professionalized. It's less of the local Sandlot club, more of a national powerhouse, to be honest, because like I said, they were beating all of these teams and people were starting to take notice, right? The newspaper accounts even mentioned that the NFL is growing worried about Frankfurt, right? And this was in 1922. And they were starting to get noticed. Between 1922 and 1923, the Yellow Jackets compiled a 6-2-1 record against NFL teams, right? So they were beating the NFL teams, so much so that the NFL invited the team to become part of the fledgling league. And again, the NFL and pro football was big in the Midwest, right? Duluth, Canton, Green Bay, Chicago. That's where the teams were playing. The New York Giants were not part of the NFL at this point. Washington was not part of the NFL, nor were the Maroons. So the first year the Yellow Jackets started, there was no other team within, I think, 200 miles of the Yellow Jackets, which meant they had to travel, other teams had to travel, but the NFL was looking to gain a foothold in the East Coast. Previous teams, like the New York Brickley Giants, they never made it, right? So the NFL really wanted an NFL team. And rather than starting a new club, it was their idea to say, hey, look at this team down in Frankfurt. They're really good. They're beating all of the NFL teams. Let's just have them kind of join the league. So a little bit different than having a new team start from scratch, which is what the Eagles did a couple of years later. But here is the certificate, and I believe it's over here on display, so certainly come look at it, of the Yellow Jackets joining the NFL. So that was a big deal. This was in 1924, right? In 1924, again, they saw success in 1925 with the NFL. Again, they hired in 1925 Guy Chamberlain as coach. So generally, the FAA would have managers of the team, which was the front office, maybe one or two people. And then they would also have a coach who was usually a player, right? So Guy Chamberlain was a player coach. They hired in 1925. He had won 3 previous championships in Canton and a couple other teams as well. And again, he further brought professionalization to the team. Right, he was also a really good player as well. And in the 1925 season, again, they started to play the NFL teams. And this picture here is of Shibe Park, right? So they were actually starting to oversell Frankfurt Stadium. So when the Chicago Bears came to town, they sold 35,000 seats at Shibe Park to see Red Grange's first pro football game on the East Coast, right? So that was a pretty big deal. They decided to move that game in 1925 to Shibe Park. And they actually played the Bears a couple years at Shibe Park since those games were so big. The Bears were the biggest pro team at the time. In fact, despite all the winning that the Yellow Jackets did against all the other teams, local, coal region, NFL teams, the Bears proved a big hurdle for them. They were 0-5 in their first 5 games against the Chicago Bears. Between Red Grange and George Halas, right, they had a tough time playing the Bears. The other teams, the Giants, as you can see here, with Jim Thorpe there, second from the left, right? No problem beating the Giants, no problem beating Buffalo, Providence, Duluth, Canton, right? What other teams? That's a lot of them. But Minnesota, again, these teams came and went during the years, right? But in the 20s, the Yellow Jackets were faring well versus the Packers as well. 1925 was the first year that they started playing the Packers as well, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But 1925, real quick, is interesting as well because of the game against the Pottsville Maroons. They got clobbered in this game, 49-0, right? And derailed an otherwise great season in 1925. And what made it worse was the winner of Philadelphia, right? The Philadelphia champion was set to play an exhibition game against a team of Notre Dame All-Stars and graduates, featuring the 4 horsemen backfield from Notre Dame. So they were going to come play an exhibition in Philadelphia against whoever was the Philadelphia champion. The Yellow Jackets beat Pottsville earlier in the year. They figured it wouldn't be a problem, but this was another one of the games where they were playing back-to-back games, actually their third game in 4 days, because they played Thanksgiving, then they played Saturday, and then they played Pottsville on Sunday. Lost 49-0. Pottsville was the city champion. They ended up playing this Notre Dame All-Star team, but the game was held at Shibe Park, and the Yellow Jackets were not happy about that. This was in Philadelphia. Pottsville is, 40, 50 miles away. This game was in the Yellow Jackets territory. The Yellow Jackets actually had a game that day as well, so they complained to the NFL. They complained to the league that Pottsville was infringing on their territory by playing this exhibition game. The NFL agreed. He said, Pottsville, if you play this game, we're going to take away your championship. Pottsville won the championship in 1925. Pottsville played the game anyway, probably for the money, right? However much money it was to sell out Shibe Park was more than whatever this NFL championship meant, right? They weren't getting any merchandising deals or TV contracts based off of it. So they played the game anyway, and the NFL said, forget it. We're taking your championship away. And they gave it to the Chicago Cardinals, right? So this is a big controversy. If you talk to anyone about from Pottsville, I'm sure they know about the 1925 championship, probably still think they deserve it. In fact, in 2003, the NFL voted again to see if they wanted to award Pottsville the championship. Every team except the Steelers and Eagles voted against it. So the Chicago Cardinals remain the 1925 championship. On paper, in our hearts, maybe it's the Maroons too. So
driving to Pottsville, there's a billboard that says home 1925.
Exactly. So yes, right. Yep. They'll never let it go. But a very interesting controversy. Again, kind of tells you about these early days, Wild West of football, right? So you had this from time to time, but in 1926, the team put it all together. And I'll have Andrew talk about this season in particular.
So as Brian mentioned, with the addition of Guy Chamberlain as player coach in 1925, the Yellow Jackets improved. They finished their season in 1925 with a 13-7 record in NFL games. So the FAA decided to keep Chamberlain on board, and they added talented players to bolster their roster. Back then, players were probably only getting hundreds of dollars to play compared to millions they see today. So basically back then it was constant changing with players changing rosters each and every year wherever they thought they could get the most money with their limited games. After training in Florida, the team got off to a hot start in 1926. They kept opposing star players like Jim Thorpe and Hall of Famer Ernie Nevers in check, and which boosted the team morale. The chemistry helped the team achieve feats that were previously out of reach. Season culminated in a showdown against the Chicago Bears in 1926, with the winner of the game likely to earn the NFL championship for the season. The game was so massive that it was moved to Yellow Jackets Stadium to Shibe Park to help accommodate the massive demand for tickets. In an era before the Super Bowls and NFL championship games, this title game approached that type of environment, had a Hollywood-style ending with the Yellow Jackets winning their first championship in their history. So we can go back the team photo.
Okay.
So star players for the 1926 season included All-Pro kicker Johnny Budd, Rudy Comstock, Tex Hammer, and Houston Stockton. There were other key player members of the squad as well: Ben Jones, Hat Moran, Doc Bruder, Ed Weir, Ned Wilcox, and running back Two-Bits Homan. Guy Chamberlain, as mentioned, was captain/manager, and Swede Youngstrom was the offensive line coach and defensive line coach. The team also added experienced athletic trainer Danny Coogan due to injuries that plagued them the previous season from constantly playing every weekend, Saturday and Sunday. The Yellow Jackets had 2 non-league games in 1926. Their first game was against the Atlantic City Roses early in the year, which they won 45-0. And they also had a non-league game right before Thanksgiving against local team Clifton Heights, which they won 10-0. So the Yellow Jackets opened their league season with a 6-6 tie against Akron, which this photo is from that game. It was in a sweltering heat. So it was a 6-6 tie, and that would be their only tie for the season. The following weekend, they shut out the Hartford Blues in back-to-back games, 13-0 at home and 10-0 away. Following week, the Jackets demolished the Buffalo Rangers 30-0, and then Frankfurt traveled to Buffalo the following day to complete its series, but the game was called off due to a field that was deemed unfit to play by the home team. Frankfurt was upset that the game was not played. The rumor was back then that the Buffalo players were planning to attend Game 7 of the World Series that afternoon, but most believe that they just didn't want to get another whooping from the Yellow Jackets. The next week, the Jackets beat the New York Giants 6-0 in back-to-back games. After their home game in Frankfurt, a group of about 1,000 fans boarded a special train to accompany the Yellow Jackets players. The Yellow Jackets band and bugle corps also joined them to New York to watch the game at Polo Grounds the following day. So this picture is from a advertisement in the program the week before, telling fans if they wanted to join, where they could purchase their train tickets. They had a few different places you could get the train from: the Frankfurt Junction, Wissonomen, and Tacony. And the Bugle Corps, which we can talk about later, they were a national championship group, and they would often travel with the team to places like the Polo Grounds and perform at halftime, and just their presence themselves would also draw crowds to the games. After their weekend series against the Giants, the Jackets earned their first ever victory over the Canton Bulldogs in 1926, a 17-0 win over Jim Thorpe's club. And in our book, I believe we'll have a picture of Jim Thorpe and his game at Frankfurt. The Yellow Jackets winning streak came to an end with a 7-6 loss to Providence, which was their only loss of the season. A missed extra point by Johnny Budd, their all-pro kicker, cost Frankfurt their chance at an undefeated season. But they followed that loss with a 6-3 win in Providence the following day. The following week, after trailing 7-0 at halftime to the Chicago Cardinals, the Yellow Jackets routed them in the second half, and they completed the game with a 33-7 win. The Yellow Jackets ladies went on the field at halftime and played a quick game, showing the boys how to play the right way in the second half. And it must have worked because of scoring the 33 unanswered points. There's a picture of the Yellow Jackets ladies team. They would occasionally play at halftime along with the midget team that we mentioned before. Next, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets defeated the Duluth Eskimos 10-0. The Jackets had a key goal line stand on future Hall of Famer Ernie Nevers to help secure the victory. There's a picture of Nevers. The Jackets crushed their familiar foe, the Dayton Triangles, 35-0 at the Yellow Jacket Stadium the following week. And then for Thanksgiving Day, they hosted the Green Bay Packers. They defeated the Packers 20-14 in what was the start of a 5-year tradition of Green Bay coming to Frankfurt to play their annual Thanksgiving game, which is pictured in the top left corner. They played their fourth game in 7 days that Saturday when they narrowly sneaked past the tough Detroit Panthers team 7-6, which is also pictured, which was leading up to the championship game. The Bears opened the 1926 season with an 11-0-2 record. Since winning percentages determine the standings, the Bears were in first place despite the Yellow Jackets having more wins with 12. Therefore, whoever won that matchup was the most likely winner of that year's league championship. So the game was moved to Scheid Park. Here's a picture of that game and a ticket for that game as well. $2.50, I believe, was the admission price, which I wish would be the tickets prices for Eagles games. The tightly contested match was scoreless after the first 3 quarters, and then the Bears scored a touchdown in the fourth quarter. Guy Chamberlain blocked that extra point, so it was a 6-0 deficit that they would have to overcome. They took advantage of on the following drive when Tuba Toman caught a 38-yard touchdown pass from Houston Stockton. Tex Hammer, who had a 50-yard reverse run on that drive, kicked a successful extra point attempt and secured the biggest win in the Yellow Jackets history. The Yellow Jackets plowed the Providence Steamrollers 24-0 on a snowy field in Frankfurt, not allowing Providence a first down the entire game. In comparison, the Yellow Jackets had 12 that game. The final game of the 1926 season is pictured in the right against the Pottsville Maroons. It was a frigid contest that finished in a 0-0 draw on a Saturday, which meant the Yellow Jackets needed to wait until the next day for the Chicago Bears to play their game. And fortunately, they did not win their game, meaning that the Frankford Yellow Jackets were determined to be the 1926 NFL champions. Also in 1926, after they won the championship, players were presented with different memorabilia. Some got pocket watches and some got charms to help commemorate their victory instead of the Super Bowl rings that we know today. In 1926, the Philadelphia Quakers also won the American Football League championship, which gave the city 2 pro football championships that year. Quakers coach Bob Fowle, which Brian mentioned earlier, stated, "We stand ready to play the Jackets anytime or anywhere they wish to determine a champion." He was the former head coach at the University of Penn and coached many future Yellow Jackets. But the Yellow Jackets refused to play in an AFL-NFL championship game, and no city championship game was ever played. The Quakers ended up playing the NFL's seventh best team that year, the New York Giants, and got crushed 31-0. So we know what the game against the Yellow Jackets would have been like. In the 1926 Yellow Jackets compiled a 14-1-2 NFL record, including 11 shutouts. They scored 28 touchdowns that season and only allowed 6. Their schedule worked in their favor as they only had 3 road games that year. They tied their first game of the season and the last game of the season and sandwiched 14 wins in between them. The Yellow Jackets' 14 wins was a record that was not tied again until 1948 when the Cleveland Browns of the American Football League went 14-0. It was not surpassed in the NFL until 1984 when the San Francisco 49ers went 15-1. And starting in 1926, the programs given out at Frankfurt home games started to include the World Championships banner on their programs.
Yep. Great, thank you. So that was it, 1926 season, the pinnacle of pro football here in Frankfurt. And, they were excited. The FAA thought this is great. We can compete with the big time teams like Chicago and the Green Bay Packers and the New York Giants, right? So what did they do? First thing after winning the championship, they fired Guy Chamberlain, their coach. No one was really sure why. It probably wasn't the best idea. The FAA president also resigned in protest after the board fired their coach. So that was kind of portending of things to come. In 1927, they finished in 7th place. In 1928, they bounced back and finished 2nd. They had the most wins, but like Andrew said, winning percentage was more important. So they missed out on the 1928 championship. 1929, they finished 3rd, right? But then the FAA had the idea, the strategy of let's get rid of our veteran players and fill the roster with younger rookies right out of college. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go well. And that was the first time really a team did that. That was the first time a team tried to rebuild, or the Sixers called it the process, right? The Yellow Jackets tried it in 1929, and it failed miserably. And it actually convinced other teams for several decades later to hang on to their veteran players at risk of doing what the Yellow Jackets did and lose so many games that early. During the 1927 season, Ignacio Molinet, or Lou Molinet, as they called him, from Cornell, played for the team. He was the first Hispanic player in the NFL. He was born in Cuba. Like I said, he played for Cornell, and he signed a $50 contract with the Yellow Jackets that season. Andrew said a couple $100. He signed for 50, and in fact, that was per game for home games. Away games, players only got paid 60% of their home game salary to defray the costs of travel and meals and all that stuff. So imagine playing a game of Frankfurt on Saturday, getting on an overnight train to go to Chicago in the freezing cold, only getting paid 60% of your salary, and then coming back the next day. So it was rough business, right? They obviously had day jobs, these players, and we'll talk about them a little bit more. Like Andrew said, Thanksgiving was a really big tradition here in Frankfurt. From 1925 to 1930, they played the Packers every year on Thanksgiving Day here in Frankfurt. You can see the mop top there. That's, of course, Curly Lambeau from the Packers. But Thanksgiving, even before playing the Packers, was a big deal. Kind of like in the same vein as the high school teams, right? Frankfurt, North Catholic, all the high school games on Thanksgiving. So that was a big deal for the neighborhood. But as 1929 rolled around and the roster wasn't great, they were also faced with some external pressures, including the Great Depression, right? The Depression came along, mills, factories closed down here in Frankfurt, people were unemployed. Some of the businesses that previously sponsored the Yellow Jackets could no longer sponsor the team. The people that were now unemployed could no longer afford to travel to home games, let alone some of the away trips, right? So it really started to take its toll on the Yellow Jackets. In 1930, the team started to ring up debt again from some of the other teams and the NFL itself. But they were allowed to play the 1931 season in hopes that they could repay some of that debt, right? So they had this pressure on them in 1931 to really get things back together and help, recover some of their losses and find a way to move forward. Well, if that wasn't bad enough, they had some issues with fires in the stadium. First, back in 1907, there was a recommendation to the board that the team gets fire insurance. I hadn't found any proof that they did, but by 1929, this photo here from the program mentions that there was a fire. It cost $2,500 in damages, and it was believed that a cigarette that was dropped by one of the spectators started the fire on the all-wooden grandstand, right? So they were trying to prevent this from happening again. But in July 27th, 1931, there was a much bigger fire at Yellow Jacket Stadium. There was belief that it was started on purpose. There was oily substances, incendiary substances. Different newspapers have different quotes. Some newspapers don't mention the possibility of arson. We talked to the fire department history. They don't have any record of it being a multi-alarm fire. So if it was a fire, it may not have been that big, but it did destroy the north stands and the fence that enclosed the grounds. So on top of all the issues with the player roster, with the Great Depression, now they had a fire, right? The stadium was no longer usable, and they had to play the remainder of their games at stadiums around the city. So the Baker Bowl, they played down at JFK, right? You can imagine a 100,000 person stadium playing there. They also played at, I believe, Franklin Field for a game, right? But again, during the Depression, people didn't have the money to travel to go to these games. Attendance was around 2,000 people. And by the time they were 2-6-1, they decided to call it quits in the 1931 season, right? So by 1931, the Yellow Jackets, because of the Great Depression, because of the fire, were unable to continue playing, right? So that happened in 1931. The NFL took the franchise back for Philadelphia. Nothing happened in 1932. And then in 1933, Bert Bell paid $2,000, I think it was $2,500 for that franchise rights to the Philadelphia. He also covered, I believe, $5,000 in Yellow Jackets debt and was re-awarded the Philadelphia franchise, which he then changed the name to, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Yellow Jackets were not a direct descendant, or the Eagles are not a direct descendant of the Yellow Jackets. Certainly the tradition, certainly the NFL franchise, right, that came back to the league was the same for the city. There was only one that they were granting. But the team and the league and the ownership was completely different. So the Yellow Jackets went from the top of football, pro football in 1926, quickly to the bottom by 1931. It was unfortunate, but some of the players and the American Legion Post did continue playing mostly baseball under the Frankford Athletic Association name. So you'll see box scores, again, mostly baseball scores throughout the 30s of the FAA continuing to play. So kind of a ignominious demise for the team, but they did still have that 1926 championship that, was incredible for the town. Real quick, I know we're getting short on time. We have several players that we just wanted to mention too. Some of them you may have heard of, some you'll hear for the first time. Hat Moran, his son, Mike Moran, is going to write the foreword for our Yellow Jackets book. But he played on the 1926 team, was more famous with the Giants. He actually scored the first touchdown in an Eagles game, but it was for the Giants. Link Lyman, also probably a little bit more famous from playing with the Bears. We have Houston Stockton, who played football at Gonzaga. And yes, he's the great-grandfather of NBA legend John Stockton, also from Gonzaga. We have Two Bits Homan. And this was actually a funny thing as we go through the book. Most of these players have nicknames, right? It's Francis Moran and William Lyman and Henry Homan, but they all went by their nicknames. And it got to the point where we were putting so many nicknames and quotes that we decided that we're going to take the quotes off of these names, and this is what we're calling them. But Two Bits Homan is a great example. He was one of the smallest players in the NFL, 5'5", played quarterback, and rumor has it he started the first touchdown dance. He, after he scored the touchdown, he went over to his teammate, shook his hand, went over to the ref, shook his hand, and then handed him the ball. Previously, players would just kind of drop the ball like rugby tries. So Two Bits at the first celebration. Guy Chamberlain, we talked about a little bit already. Lud Ray as well, who played at Penn on that 1919 team and then was the Eagles' first coach. Charlie Rogers, he played at University of Pennsylvania, so was really popular around here. He was also from Camden, so they called him the Camden Comet, and later coached Delaware University. In the middle there is Les Affland. He was also a local guy from Bryn Athyn and Swarthmore. He played on that Quakers team in 1926, but him and his brother also started the Affland Tree Company, right? So you may see those orange trucks around town. That's him and his brothers. Tex Hammer led the team in touchdowns. We'll go through some more. Ed Weir from Nebraska, and Wally Deal, one of the team's kickers for many years. Jim Mullaney there on the right. As Andrew mentioned, the Yellow Jackets were one of the first teams to hire a trainer full-time. That's because they were getting banged up from playing so many back-to-back games. Jim Mullaney was a guy who they found down in Wildwood at one of the games. He was a lifeguard in the summer and then trained the team in the fall time. Swede Youngstrom, we mentioned already. Dr. Joe Alexander in the middle. Doc was not a nickname. He was an actual doctor. And he was one of the players that you would see play on a lot of teams, even in the same week. But this happened all the time back then. We had mentioned Ray Crowder, Bull Benham. He played for the Yellow Jackets and the Quakers too. And he was the captain of the team in 1925. And Guy Chamberlain, as the coach, actually benched him as the captain after they lost that 49-0 game to Pottsville. So Guy Chamberlain, like I said, brought that professionalism. He wanted to show the team that he wasn't afraid to bench the captain after getting their butts whooped. Herb Joesting, pretty famous. He was elected to College Football Hall of Fame, All-American from Minnesota. You have Pud Connaughton, who played at Georgetown, but before that, from St. Joe's Prep. So again, local guys, mostly from the local colleges. Speaking of which, Joey Maxwell on the left went to Roman Catholic, and he was part of the Notre Dame offensive line known as the Seven Mules, who blocked for the Four Horsemen. Again, a lot of nicknames back then. Max Reeds was the center for the 26 and 27 season. And then we have Paul Fitzgibbon, who played just one season in 1927, but then went on to found the Permanente Medical Group, or Kaiser Permanente. So he played on the team as well. So you see a lot of these people that played on other teams, went on to do other things. A lot of famous people came through the Frankford Yellow Jackets team. And we just want to finish up here with a couple quick fun photos of the Frankford fans. As the papers refer to them, the Frankfurters, right? Rain, sleet, snow, heat, right? They were here for the games. They came out to the games. All the home games were well attended. The Yellow Jackets mostly played home games. And like we said, they won a lot of them, right? So you can see the crowd here out in their suit and ties, hats. It's interesting, some of the photos we have, they're a little brighter, maybe a little overexposed. Some of them are a little bit darker. Susan can certainly speak more to the photography side of things. But we're just happy to have found so many of these original photos that probably haven't been published before, maybe not even made into photos, let alone digitized. But we're happy to be able to bring them out and have people see them here through the book. But you can see the crowds, right? Imagine tailgating, right? This was the old style tailgating in a parking lot by your car before the game, right? Here they are in the top. Down at the bottom, there's those long lines to those tiny little houses, right? They're the outhouses, of course, right? So you're waiting in line for the bathroom just like we do nowadays. Right? Yellow Jackets band, it's an offshoot of the American Legion Post 211 here in Frankfurt. Like I said, always an early sponsor of the team, early supporter of the team. A lot of the players of the original FAA came from the Legion Post, right? They helped continue the team after the 1931 fire and brought it back to its more local roots. But all the while, they were leading the pregame festivities, the halftime festivities, the road trips. The Yellow Jackets band was a really big part of the team. And as you can see here, Bobby Calhoun, the midgets team, the lady cheerleaders that started playing and became the women's team. Right? The program would also offer free tickets if you found a picture of yourself in the following week's program. They had the Lucky Rooter contest each week. And then, of course, the Yellow Jackets mascot, not a jacket itself, but a donkey. It was often found doing landscaping around the fields. Mm-hmm. So the Yellow Jackets had a lot of characters. They were community-based, right? Anything having to do with the area, the Boy Scouts, the hospital, right? The local parks, the schools. It was all part of the Yellow Jackets football team. So in a big way, there was more than a football team, right? So we're happy to help continue that legacy. What's going on here at this Historical Society, Howard Barnes's book, right? Some of the legacy we've seen nowadays, the local fire company has a Yellow Jackets patch. They're known as the Yellow Jackets here in Frankfurt. I think it was back in 2003. The Eagles wore the yellow and blue uniforms. You see a few Brian Dawkins jerseys still floating around in that colors. It wasn't really well received. They haven't really done anything since that. But we all like the blue and yellow colors. We're happy to take any questions now. The Yellow Jackets book is going to be available next fall. We have T-shirts available that 100% of the proceeds that go to the Historical Society. And we also have some of our Eagles books for sale here. If you're online, you can visit shibesports.com to get both of them. But thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate your time. Thanks for coming out. Happy to hear any questions or, yes, we'll start here.
As far as the Pennsylvania blue laws, why could Pottsville play home games?
Great question. Great question. Great question. It was not enforced in Pottsville. Further outside of Philadelphia, the blue laws were really just less enforced. They were enforced much more here in Philly with the pro sports teams. But yeah, that's a great question. As you got out, Pottsville played all their games on Sundays.
And really, that area was incredibly rural, and that's part of probably the reason why.
Yep. Same with the coal region teams.
Right. I guess my question is, when they kind of trickled out of the community base into, I guess, more of the professional post-college, is there a percentage of, is it like mostly Ivies, is it mostly Pennsylvania, is it mostly, like, who is in that?
The college.
Yeah, like percentage-wise, in those first couple of years, like as that being, I guess, NFL players.
There were like a few players from Lafayette, I
Right, right.
believe.
I mean, obviously you had your
Yeah.
Ivies, you had Notre Dame, you had that, I don't think it was called Pac-10 back then.
Right. The West Coast.
Yeah.
No West Coast players, really. But the book, Howard's book, and we'll have some of this info in our book too. And the newspapers actually did well. When they listed the players and their numbers and positions, they listed their colleges too. So just reading off the 1926 roster, the colleges, Lehigh, Washington and Lee, Lehigh, Bucknell, Georgetown, Lafayette, Colgate, Annapolis, Carnegie, Penn, Swarthmore, right? So mostly local colleges. But yeah, I haven't seen other than Hugh Stockton from Gonzaga.
Okay, you being a Penn grad, and obviously with the early Eagles contingent of being Penn grads.
Yep.
I just didn't know that it was just kind of like a cattle shoot from Westville to.
It wasn't really, no, it wasn't all Penn grads that came to Yellow Jackets. Some did, some went to the other pro NFL teams, or the Giants, the Bears. Some stopped playing football altogether, right? This wasn't the most glamorous of jobs. There were certainly a lot of Penn players, but there were a lot of other local. Lafayette was probably the second biggest
yeah.
one. And not many Temple players. This was just before Temple hired Pop Warner, and their program really took on a national significance in the late 20s. Yeah, Lafayette, Swarthmore, Lehigh, Penn were the big ones. Bruce.
We have a couple of questions from online.
Sure.
Richard Iaconelli asks, are the Yellow Jackets represented in the NFL Hall of Fame?
Yes, but there's not much there. This book is there, which is great. I don't believe there's a display currently. Occasionally they did have one. But again, hopefully our book helps bring this out a little bit more. We'll certainly be sending a copy of the book there. But in addition to the Historical Society, we did get a lot of photos from other archives like Chicago, Providence, Penn Archives. The Hall of Fame had a few photos, but most of them we had found already elsewhere.
They do have a little section up there.
Do they?
It's like a little section.
Okay. So there is a little bit there, but not enough.
Also, Michael Moran asked,
Mike,
why did the FAA let Chamberlain go after he won the championship?
Mike asked this after our previous lecture too. I have no idea. He probably asked for more money is really my guess, because there wasn't anything in their board meeting notes that mention it. And like I said, their president at the time resigned, so it seemed like a pretty contentious thing that some people wanted him, some people didn't. But we haven't found any smoking gun to have him fired. I mean, he just won the championship, so it does seem rather peculiar.
Yeah, you did mention that he benched Bull Bettman.
Yeah.
Maybe
Maybe there
could
was some
have-
politics
yeah, it could have
involved.
been politics.
Yep. So we don't have a definitive answer, but with Mike's help, I think we'll find something.
I saw when they agreed with the Packers were here, their uniform said Acme Packers. Did you have to work for the Acme packing company?
I think- No, they sponsored the team though. But yeah, it was similar here in Philadelphia. A lot of the local schools had club teams. The factories had teams. And you would see that in some, more so the baseball box scores. They would play Litt Brothers. They would play Campbell Soup Company baseball team, right? So the railroad, certainly baseball team, the Navy Yard, whatever ship was docked at the Navy Yard, they would play the sailors on the team. So the Yellow Jackets were unique in that they would take a game against anyone. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
With the Yellow Jackets, where they played is in Frankfurt, which so why were they called that?
The Frankfurt Athletic Association started the organization, and they started as Frankfurt.
Which nobody plays, you says it's not even Frankfurt, which nobody.
Yes. That's, yeah.
It's kind of like
It was Philadelphia.
It's kind of like how the New York Giants play in the Meadowlands, and Dallas plays in Fort Worth,
Yeah.
and Washington Commanders play in Virginia
Maryland.
or Maryland.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, I mean, it was considered, by the time the FAA started in 1899, it was part of Philadelphia, right? The act of incorporation was that 1856, 54 had already happened. So Frankfurt, unfortunately, was now Philadelphia, right? So it was all Philadelphia. But the people, the business leaders who started the Frankfurt Athletic Association were from Frankfurt. Most of their businesses were on Frankfurt Avenue. So again, I think that was part of it. The Avenue, which we didn't really get into, chapter 1 of the book deals with the community in general, which we didn't talk about a lot today because I'm sure people are familiar with it. But, the Frankfurt Avenue, of course, is the major artery here and the place of organization for the clubs, the churches, the teams, pretty much everything in the neighborhood. So, it was more using the name Frankfurt, probably more than anything.
Kind of like where you go anywhere, you say you're from Philly, and someone says, I'm from Philly, and we're at St. Redding.
Yeah.
Right, right, yes, exactly. But again, this was, like I said, a big source of pride for the community. They mentioned how important it was them to see the name Frankfurt all over the place, country and the world. Do we have a question in the back?
I did some digging up the Yellow Jackets, and I know, does anybody remember the actor Charlie Chaplin?
Yeah, of course.
When he died, his wife remarried a Yellow Jacket player. I forget what player it was, but I read that.
Okay, so we got a Charlie Chaplin connection as well.
Ray Crowder, remember Ray Crowder?
Yep.
He started the football sweats.
That's right.
Yeah, we
I forgot to mention that, but that is in the book. We have a picture of him.
I don't know if he's still alive, but I think his son might run it now.
Where is he? There he is. Yeah, Ray Crowther, he invented the blocking sled that teams use in practice. So very interesting. Question, Bruce.
One last one. Joe Spagna asked, what happened to all these Eastern Pennsylvania teams during the 1918 flu season? Did you see anything about that?
To be honest, between 1902 and 1921, there aren't a lot of game accounts. But the Yellow Jackets still had a fairly full schedule of at least 12 games a season. Then they started really picking up in 22, 23. But it seemed like the big teams were still around. Now they change names all the time. So they would play Buffalo from year to year and they would have different names, but it would still be the Buffalo All-Americans or
Rangers.
the Rangers, the Bills and Bisons came eventually. But it didn't seem to affect their schedule as much. I saw a lot of the same teams that I saw earlier, Atlantic City, the coal mining teams, Wildwood, Holmesburg, things like that. Now, I'm sure the rosters were decimated, and the rosters were a lot thinner than they were in previous years. So, and World War I, of course, too, was a big deal. And that's one thing I forgot to mention, too. Part of the benefit of having the team as a community nonprofit, they didn't have to pay any war tax on their gate receipts during World War I. So that was a benefit as opposed to some of the other teams. But it did seem that the other teams on their schedule were pretty consistent during those years. Question here? Do we have a last one? Anything else? All right, well, again, if you want a t-shirt, please grab one. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm certain speakers will be able to answer some questions